Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kathy Schmitz, Executive Director for the Vilas County Economic Development Corporation, and we're delighted that you're here today. So thank you for joining us for our Lunch and Learn to hear from our very special guest, Scott Dawson, the author of The Art of Working Remotely and the Handbook for the Modern Worker. Before we begin, though, I do want to give a very special thanks to Associated Bank for their generous support of this program and our work to support small business and remote workers here in the North Woods. And so for today's program, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we'll answer them right after his remarks. And do stay tuned for the whole program because at the end, we will have two of Scott's books to give away to two lucky attendees at the end of this program. So now for tips on the future of remote working, please join me in welcoming Scott Dawson.
Great, thank you so much, Kathy. I'm gonna go ahead and get my screen sharing going on here. First of all, I'd like to start by thanking the Vilas County Economic Development Corporation for having me today. And I understand it's a beautiful day there, and it is a beautiful day here. So a special thank you for spending your lunchtime with me today. We're gonna talk about thriving in the evolving workplace. And of course, that's going to center around working remotely. I love any chance I can talk about my career and working remotely. It's had a huge impact on my life. And for some reason, remote work has received a lot of attention in the last few years. This is a big number. This, for me, is Remote Work Day 5,500. And it just so happens it's kind of a nice round number today. But that's the business days between the day I started working remotely and today, subtracting out approximately 20 paid time off days a year. And if you started working remotely during the pandemic and struggled at it, you might ask, how is that possible? How do you keep this up for 5,500 days? I don't have an answer other than every day adds up. And my story starts interestingly enough. I never set out to work remotely for most of my career. It truly was an accident. I started working remotely on May 1st, 1998. I'm a user experience designer and developer with a background in computer science, and I help build websites and mobile applications. I worked for 2 years in traditional offices very early in my career, and then I was 15 years remote at my first company, 8 years remote at my current company, and I've worked remotely as both a manager and an individual contributor. I'm married with 2 kids, and this picture is from our trip to Europe, and that was August of 2019, 6 months before the world changed and we all entered lockdown. The plan for the next half hour or so, I'm going to talk first about my remote work journey. How did it start? How did it evolve? And I want to spend most of the time talking about actionable tips that can help you find success as you work remotely. And then we'll get a little bit into what the future of remote work looks like, at least from our vantage point right here. You know, some companies are pulling people back to offices, whereas others are going fully remote. Let's get into it. 24 years remote. You know, a lot happened for me in the span from 1996, when I first started working, to present day. 26 years ago, I was fresh out of graduate school and I had a few choices for full-time employment. I had an option to work in the oil and gas industry in California. I had an option to work in management consulting in Virginia. I was offered a position with a company that worked on fuel systems for fighter jets in Vermont. And I had finance in New York City. And of course, the young me was like, bright lights, big city, let's go. Off I went, not to New York City proper, but to Long Island City. And if you're not familiar with the geography of the New York metro area, Long Island City is across the East River from the island of Manhattan. This picture on the left is my dad taking a picture of me in front of my office building. At the time, Long Island City was mostly industrial, but this tower rose out of the ground like a phoenix. I worked there on the 17th floor. My office is the picture's kind of funny to look at. That's 1996 technology there for you. But I had a nice cubicle. You know, I had floor to ceiling windows. I had a decent view. I loved my colleagues. It was a really great job, but it had its drawbacks. A lot of months of the year, I would arrive at work before sunrise. I would leave after sunset. And I dealt with traffic and stress 30-minute train ride to and from work, and that was on a good day. And I wasn't very healthy either, and I think stress factored into that a lot. That was short-lived though. So my initial job at this company was a rotation program, and they sent me to Zurich, Switzerland. I didn't mind that at all. So I was there for 3 months. I traveled a lot on the weekends, and I got to experience a different culture in a regional technology group. And most happily, I became engaged to my girlfriend. So back stateside, this is early in 1998, I had a candid conversation with my boss. As a married couple, we were not interested in metropolitan life. And I did not have an agenda. I just went and told my boss, hey, heads up, I think I'm going to look for other jobs, either like an internal transfer within this company or just looking for something else. And I explained my rationale. And he calmly suggested telecommuting. He said, we really like the work that you're doing for us. We really don't want to lose you. Why don't you find a place to live where you want to, and we'll try out this telecommuting thing. And I never had thought about it. I never sought this out. I never thought I'd be standing here decades later talking to you about a career mostly spent working remotely. So my boss at the time couched it as a trial. He said, let's go ahead and do this for 3 months. We'll put together what we expect the benefits to be, some ways to measure it, some ways to assess it. And if it doesn't work after 3 months, come on back to New York City and you can still work here. And before the pandemic, that was cited as a very sound strategy if you were interested in working remotely, to actually lobby your boss to let that happen. The pandemic was a poor way to get most of the people who are in remote eligible jobs in the world to do it, but it is what it is. So I was married in July and moved from Long Island to Waltham, Massachusetts. My company paid for an ISDN line from the telephone company. That was the state of the art in 1998. It was twice the speed of dial-up. I had no training in remote work. I learned as I went along. And then 2 years into remote work, I moved to Fairport, New York. That's farther west for more reasonable rents and to be closer to family. And then we moved to our current spot. In 2003, we built our current home where I'm standing. I'm in a place called Tompkins County in central New York. We are very close to family. My parents live on the other side of town, and my wife's parents moved here. They were a military family and wanted to move wherever we ultimately settled. There were good schools, but also the ease of getting to larger city centers. That was important to us too. It's a rural area, but there's good infrastructure. And one of the things that Kathy was talking to me about is the broadband initiative that Vilas County has. And that's very important to remote worker viability. I've never really struggled with infrastructure. There are times when we've had power outages or broadband issues, but by no means is it chronic, and by no means does it hurt my productivity. I'm in a region called the Finger Lakes, New York State. The Finger Lakes is known for gorges and waterfalls. It's the middle of wine country. There are 3 different wine trails that go around the lakes, microbreweries, tons of opportunities for hiking, biking, other types of recreation. The photograph in the middle is the one that makes me happiest. So that is Taganic Falls, and it is the tallest free-falling waterfall in the northeastern United States. So this is 5 minutes from my house. I ran there this morning, and that's how I started my workday. Now, Vilas County is also a vacation destination, like Tompkins County. Y'all have 1,300 lakes and 70 streams and rivers, one of the densest concentrations of freshwater lakes and streams in the world. So I see a lot of parallels between our 2 counties. And one of the best parts of living in this kind of location is you can have the best of both worlds. If I need to go to New York City, it's 4.5 hours. It's a long weekend if you want to be comfortable about it, but you can do a day trip and see a show, and it's not unreasonable. And I understand that travel time for you is 3 to 4.5 hours to Green Bay or Milwaukee. You can have kind of the best of both worlds. Remote work advocacy. I haven't always been, rah, remote work, right? I spent actually most of my career just keeping my head down and doing my job, not really seeing it as this very, very special thing. But in 2016, I saw in me a need for more community. I've always been involved outside of work in my local community, and that's filled me socially. But I wanted to create a community for remote workers. So in December of 2016, I started a Twitter chat for remote work. I called it WFH chat, or work from home chat. And literally the first few chats, I was chatting with myself. I had an account that asked questions and I answered the questions. And it was one of those things of, if you build it, they will come. So over 5 years that I ran the chat, we had 250 episodes, 1,500 questions asked, and hundreds of unique participants from all over the world. It was very rewarding, but all good things must come to an end. So that's why the 5-year tenor of that. The art of working remotely is also a very interesting story, and not unlike my foray into remote work. It was kind of an accident. One of my colleagues at work, he was a new dad and he was home and he was struggling. He really couldn't find his groove and get his work done. So he started chatting me and asking all these tactical questions and sharing his personal struggles. So I answered the questions. And he said, "Scott, this is great, but you need to share this more broadly," right? And I'm like, "Well, what do you mean?" He's like, "You need to write it down and like do something with it." And that was the catalyst. I started writing. Every morning I sat down before I did anything else. It was at the dining room table. And I spent a half an hour writing every weekday. And after 6 months, I had written the book. And then during the pandemic, I challenged myself to try and write a remote work oriented tip every day in 2021. And that project was successful. I wrote 365 tips for who I term the modern worker. I published them on Twitter and LinkedIn. And in December of 2021, I published that project as another book. So those were all really creative and fun things to do to help advocate and help the remote work community. Let's get into some recommendations for success. My number one tip, based on my own experience, regardless of how you work, is a super simple prescription. Commit, deliver, and repeat. Been doing this my whole career. Remember that you promised to do a job, you do that job, and you do it every day. And I found that this is the simplest equation for building trust. Over time, people start to get to know you as somebody who delivers and is reliable. But there's so much more to it than that. So I'm going to divide advice into 2 main categories. For those who are working as entrepreneurs while they're remote, you have your own business, or you're working remotely for other companies and you're on a team. So that's the category that I'm in. There's a pretty substantial overlap. In fact, the tips for people working on their own are a substantial subset of those who collaborate with others. Entrepreneurs. I think the number one challenge for entrepreneurs is to avoid overworking. The best thing you can do is to have consistent start and end hours. And the best way to enforce those is to have startup and shutdown routines. Some people have a morning walk to signal that they're kind of commuting. You go for a walk, you come back, and you sit down and work. You go to a consistent place that signals it's time for work. At the end of the day, I have a shutdown routine. I close my laptop lid. Some days I actually say goodbye. And if you find yourself working at a table that's not like a dedicated office, have a place where you can put your work-related materials, your laptop, your phone, your papers, and put them out of sight. And you won't be tempted to work more often than you want to. It can be tempting as an entrepreneur to not set reasonable deadlines for yourself. You might take on more work than you should. You might say you're going to be more aggressive than you should. So set reasonable deadlines for yourself so you do have time to disconnect. You do have time to discern what you want your next project to be. And then certainly, if you're at the end of a very large task or you just something that's not pleasant and you've worked on it for a few hours, reward yourself for a job well done. I like to play little tricks with myself. It's like, if I finish this thing, I'm going to get another cup of coffee. If I finish this other thing, I'm going to take a break to go for a walk. Or I'm really happy with what I did this week. I'm going to shove off early on a Friday afternoon and enjoy the outdoors, right? So think about ways to reward yourself. Staying focused can be really hard when you're by yourself. In an office environment with others around you, you're kind of inherently thinking, I'm being watched. But at home, you don't have that. So there's a few things you can do to stay focused. One is work in a dedicated space. Other things around you remove that can pull your focus. Don't have things in your periphery that are calling for your attention. I struggled with distractions early in my career. When I lived in Fairport before our current home, I was addicted to 2 games, Age of Empires and Need for Speed. And my solution for that was literally to throw them away. It gutted me, but I took my steering wheel peripheral, and I took the CD-ROMs and I threw them in the trash. I didn't play those games anymore. Silence notifications on your phone. This technology is great for staying connected with other people, but it's horrible for pulling your focus when you don't want it pulled. So literally all of my notifications except text are silenced on my phone. Some of you might laugh at this one. Don't become obsessed with doing chores. So for me, I like a clean house, and I will look at something like, oh my gosh, the dishes need cleaning. And then while I'm doing that, I say, oh, this thing over here needs cleaning up. And oh, it looks like the laundry needs doing. And if you're not careful, like every day can look like a nonstop chore fest. So one thing that I've done is I'm a full grown adult, right? And I created a chore chart for myself. And the chore chart, I keep it in Todoist. And literally, every day it has one thing that I allow myself to do. And if I see something else that needs doing, I don't do it because I know that has its turn a couple of days from now. So having some discipline around those types of things can be helpful as well. You get in your home office, you do your work, and you do it well. And I put a note in here about Pomodoro too. I don't personally use Pomodoro, but there are some techniques out there to help you stay focused. Pomodoro is kind of a time slicing technique where you work for half an hour, you get a small break, and you put enough of those together, you get a bigger break. So if you like that kind of discipline in your day, check it out. If it works for you, that's great. Managing expectations is really important as an entrepreneur. And I'm talking about expectations with your clients and those others that you interact with throughout your day. So number one, let your clients know what you'll do and when you do it. When you commit to doing it. It goes back to the number one tip. Bonus points if you convey that information in a persistent place where they can always see it. Many of the successful behaviors around working remotely have communication as a common thread. In an office, you communicate all the time, but when you're remote, the need to communicate and communicate well are far more amplified. You should tell clients when you're going to be away. And I'm talking about like for days at a time, like I'm taking a few days off, I'm going on vacation, not for trips to the post office. And then let others know in your workspace, like if you have family or friends that you're sharing a space with, let them know when you need to be heads down. Like let's say you're really focused on something or you're doing a presentation like this. There's nobody in my house right now, but if they were here, I would have told them about it. I would have shut my door. Setting boundaries, being always on will burn you out. So make plans to turn off work periodically. And part of that is learning the value of saying no. I struggle mightily with saying no. So does my wife. And I think we're happier sometimes when we say no because we're demonstrating that we value our time that much and we don't regret it. It's also important to safeguard time in your calendar. There's a few hacks that you can use your calendar for. If I didn't block time in my calendar for work to happen, I would have meetings all day, every day. And I literally have a recurring appointment with myself every morning for 2 hours, and it's called deep work. And yeah, it gets scheduled over sometimes, but not all the time. So that's one thing. And the other thing is schedule an appointment with yourself for lunch. Figure out every day when you want to have your lunch, block it off. I actually have it show as out of office. And again, you might not take all that time, but I block off an hour because it's important to have the option of taking that time if I really do need it. And then work in your window. As an entrepreneur, you are your own boss. You're not stuck working 9 to 5. So set hours that make sense for you. Are you a morning person or an evening person? Do you have to work with people in other time zones? You can do things as creative as like splitting your day. And ironically, when I was putting these slides together, the New York Times published a great article about this rise in an alternative workday. They were talking about people working from 9 to 2, taking a break to do something they wanted to do, enjoy a dinner, and then going out and hitting their office again in the evening hours when things are quieter again. I'm going to talk about teams now. There's 3 slides here about people working on teams. And these suggestions are not just for managers. Anyone on a team can and should take an active role in making sure these things happen. So strong teams don't just have a strong manager. Strong teams have strong team players. How do you know your team is as effective as possible? Setting clear expectations. So managers need to set clear expectations in a persistent place. They might be a team-wide set of expectations. This is what our group goals are, but they also might be one-on-one goals, and you might put them in a performance management system. The important thing is that they're documented. If you don't have a target, you can't hit it, right? If you as an employee don't feel that you have a clear understanding about what's expected, ask. And you could also propose your own goals and have a conversation about it. That's usually what I do every year is I'm proactive. I write down what I see myself doing that year and I have a conversation about it, and then it gets codified. Now that the expectations are clear and people know what they need to do, give your team the tools and environment they need to succeed. That might be software or hardware or professional development. Set them up for success. 2 years ago, ironically, right as the pandemic started, my laptop at work started really misbehaving. And I raised the alarm, knowing how long it could take to get new hardware. And I was so grateful that I did, because if I had to struggle with that for years at a time, my job would have been incredibly demoralizing. Monitor and adjust as you learn to deliver as a distributed team. This is everybody's responsibility again. So think about back to May of 2020. We're kind of new with this working remotely thing as a team. And think about May of this year. Like, what has changed solutions-wise, process-wise? There are tools out there that didn't exist 2 years ago that I'm really enjoying using right now. Monitor and adjust. And as you're doing that, keep what works and don't be afraid of ditching what doesn't. Teams adopted new processes and platforms for collaboration, and it truly would be a mistake to go back to the old way of doing things. Within education and tech and healthcare, there were new ways invented of doing things, and processes were all streamlined. We all had to be better communicators to have everything work as well as it did. One thing that I harp on with my team is making sure that everybody knows where to go to get information. There's no siloed information. If somebody sends an email, for example, and I think it's something that I would want to refer to later, I suggest they put it in, we have a platform called Confluence, but there's a ton of different places where you can put things in kind of a blog format or a Wikipedia format. And that's just so much better for institutional knowledge. And then be compassionate. A lot has been said about empathy in the workplace, but I think it's really more about compassion. And I came across this anecdote in a book called The Art of Happiness. The Dalai Lama relates the relationship between empathy and compassion this way. Picture yourself walking along a mountainous trail, and you come across a person being crushed by a boulder on their chest. And the empathetic response is to feel the same sense of crushing suffocation, rendering you helpless. But the compassionate response is to recognize that the person is in pain and is suffering, and you do everything you can do to alleviate their suffering. It sounds a little familiar from the past few years. A compassionate workplace, I think, is an effective workplace. And I would say at least a quarter of my communication in one-on-one meetings is personal in nature, where I can connect with the other person on that level. Hey, productivity. How do you ensure that when you're working, you get the max output from yourself? So who feels that they spend too much time in unnecessary meetings? I totally do. Reduce or eliminate meetings. More meetings was a common pandemic reaction. It was an overcompensation for not being in person. Literally overnight, everything was a meeting. And I actually reached out to my managers at one point and I said, this is a problem. We, at least if we have to keep these meetings, let's get them grouped together. So I lobbied to get them grouped together in the morning, so I would have afternoon time to be in flow. And I'll talk about flow in a little bit. One of my favorite manager conversations was when they came and gave me some guardrails. They said this to the whole team, if you find yourself in a meeting where you are not needed, simply leave. That's an amazing permission, and I've used it. If you're scheduling meetings, be good about making attendees optional if they are optional. Some people like to know that a meeting is happening, but not feel compelled to go to it. They just need to be aware that it's happening. You might agree also as a team that certain periods or days are meeting free, which would give everyone a great chance to get work done. And I have a note here about starting meetings at the 5-minute or 35-minute mark. There's been a lot said in recent months about this. By doing that, it gives people a chance to take a quick break between meetings. And it also is a little bit of a forcing function to get people there on time. So if you have a meeting that you've been invited to that starts at 5 after, you're not going to be the person that shows up at 8 minutes after or 10 minutes after. So it's a little bit of a hack to making sure you can start on time. I talked a little bit about distractions, but they can derail productivity. So whether it's your phone or your personal email that's constantly pinging at you or a television on in the background, If you find that you're distracted, identify what it is and mitigate it. For me, there's a few things that I use to not be so distracted. I have two laptops, which I know not everybody can have, but I have a work laptop that my company provided, and I have a personal laptop, and they are not open at the same time. So one is in a drawer next to my desk, and at the beginning and the end of the day, they trade spaces. So I'm not tempted very often to check personal email. I have to use my phone for that. But a door for me is also a really great mechanism for cutting down on distractions. Okay, flow. So if you haven't heard the term flow, it's basically when you get into that mode of work where time kind of melts away and you look up and you're like, oh my gosh, an hour's gone by. Like that's a state of flow. It can be a huge way to be productive. So create conditions to get yourself into that state and keep you there. And a lot of that is, cutting down on distractions and creating conditions for you to get into flow. Blocking time in your calendar is a great way to do that. You're making a reservation with yourself. I also took a few sessions with this service called Cave Day. If you Google Cave Day, all one word, they're a service where you go into essentially a Zoom room with a group of people, and they have multiple cave sessions during the day. And you all share what you're going to work on for the next few hours. And it's full of people who work in companies and entrepreneurs. Like, it's a total mixture. And I say, hey, I'm Scott. I'm going to be designing this thing, for the next 2 hours. And literally, you got a bunch of people on the side, and they're almost like an accountability measure. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Again, whatever works for you is great. And then as a manager, don't micromanage. Just because you can't see someone sitting in their chair doesn't mean they're not being productive. So you signal to the people on your team that you trust them when you resist the urge to get every single detail from them about how they're doing their job. So just don't micromanage. Engagement. How do you stay engaged with your coworkers as a distributed worker? We need technology for this. We're not in the same room. There was a study that revealed workers who believe their employer is a technology leader feel a heightened sense of belonging when compared with those working for perceived technology laggards. So ask, what technology do I have that helps me feel connected to others I work with and to the material I need to do my job? So hopefully there is a solution that works well for you and your team. And now that you have that solution in place, create space to socialize. It's not all about work. So early in the pandemic, I created a virtual hangout for my team. We met once a week initially, and there were really simple rules. It wasn't a very long instruction page. No shop talk, have fun. And over the years, we've decreased the frequency, but it's really great to get together as a team and just socialize outside of your tactical work stuff. I like to start and end work calls, if I can, with casual conversation. I relate to others as I would in person. I like to use items in the background, ask questions. If I see an interesting piece of art, I'll ask what the story is behind that. Or if it's a Friday, I'll ask about weekend plans. And usually that leads to something far bigger, and it opens the door to conversation. I love this one. Not everyone is totally on board with being open and vulnerable with your coworkers, but there's two parts of this. One is normalize saying, I don't know. It opens the door to learning. I'll share an anecdote from my wife. She teaches math, and she was talking to her students about taking a math risk. And the students were like, well, what do you mean taking a math risk, Mrs. Dawson? And she says, if you are sitting there and realizing that you don't know what I'm talking about, there's a high chance, that there are others in the room who feel the same way, who don't feel comfortable raising their hand and saying, I don't get it. And so the very next day, she had a student raise their hand in class and say, Mrs. Dawson, I'm about to take a math risk. And they said, I don't really understand this. And you could see the relief in the classroom. She said it was magical. So I like taking math risks all the time. I learn a lot. And then socially, also being open and vulnerable. You can't always talk about the weather and your kids. Open up and talk to your colleagues about other things. It'll help those relationships grow, and you'll learn a lot about them. And then a little appropriate humor, appropriate's important here, goes a long way. We're all human. And when we're too serious about work, it feels more like work. When you can have fun while you're doing it, it can be a whole lot better. Part 3, where are we headed? We see this pull back to the office with this need to be synchronous in real time and face-to-face, and debates about how important that is. Before the pandemic, remote work was talked about, but not as much as it is today. It's been studied from every angle during the last 2 years. And one thing is clear, we got really good at working remotely during the pandemic. It's not for everybody and it's not for every situation. Companies announced return to work plans and shifted them and deferred them, and the virus continued to go around the world. And other companies during this time said, forget this. We're just going to be 100% remote. There's an obvious reason why remote work wasn't widespread until we had this large-scale global experiment. A lot of managers have a pretty unfounded fear that being out of sight means you're slacking off. But during the pandemic, while getting our work done, workers reported increases in job satisfaction, physical health, work-life balance, and happiness in their work environment. A year into the pandemic, PricewaterhouseCoopers had a US remote work survey, and they found that 83% of employers said the shift to remote work was successful for their company. And that was a 10% increase from the year prior. So we got companies to be even more comfortable with this over time. I like this slide because it shows how a mind can change over time. So Jamie Dimon is the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, and he's at the helm of 125,000 employees. That's a lot of people. And he's a very vocal critic of remote work. 6 months into the pandemic in September of 2020, the bank announced that they were going to have folks come back to their offices by September 21st. He's like, it's been 6 months, it's been a great experiment, but we really need to be together. Obviously didn't happen for very long. May 4th of 2021, I love this quote, it made my blood boil. People don't like commuting, but so what? And obviously it didn't happen still. And then April of this year, the company announced that it expects to have half of its employees work in person because they have to, right? They're retail bank branch workers, they work security or in facilities, but the other half of that 125,000 people, 40% would be able to embrace a hybrid work model, coming into the office a few days a week, and the remaining 10% working remote full-time. That is a very big shift in thinking over a 2-year period. So that's the word of the day, is hybrid. That's kind of where we're headed. And there are exceptions, right? But we're experiencing a workplace transformation. We're not going to go back fully to where we were before. Slack did a survey of 9,000 workers in 6 different countries, and they found that 72% of workers prefer a hybrid model. Get a little bit of both worlds. You're working from home and you're also being able to see your colleagues in person. 12% wanted all office all the time, and 13% would like to always work home if given the choice. Interestingly now, versus earlier in the pandemic, preference is driving much of working from home, not necessity. So among those who have a workplace outside their house, 61% now say they are choosing to not go into their workplace, while 38% say they're working from home because their workplace is either closed or unavailable to them. And I'll talk about what unavailable means. So even though workplaces are available again, the percentage of workers staying home all or most of the time is far higher than pre-pandemic levels. On the bottom here, 64% said they were working from home early in the pandemic because their office was closed, and 36% said they were choosing to work from home. And that's totally flipped over 2 years. So that 36% on the bottom right has shifted up into 61%. Now, included in that 61% are an increased share of people who relocated away from their workplace. And that's why they're working from home. Pew Research, which did this graphic, said that was a jump from 9% in October 2020 to 17%. So as a share of people, they just voted with where they live. They said, I'm not going to live in the city anymore. I'm going to go wherever I want, and I'm going to work there, and I'm going to keep my job. And it's mostly good news. People are reporting balance. Check. Getting work done? Absolutely. Advancement is kind of a mixed bag. And I think it's easier now to advance than it was decades ago, but there still is a very real concern of out of sight, out of mind. And that's something I've struggled with for my career. And then this bottom one, this is the worrisome one. Connection needs a lot of work. And I think this label, less connected to coworkers, we could probably expand on that, less connected to others. Because when you're home, whether it's coworkers or other people, you have to be really intentional about getting out and meeting them. And that's a problem that requires a lot of solutions from a lot of people, whether it's individuals, companies, industry groups, communities, civic organizations. I'll point out that Vilas County sponsoring these meetups for remote workers is a really good step in the right direction. And then what about the people who are like, I don't really care what's going on, I'm going back to the office? That's about 1 in 5 or 22% who say that they can work from home, but they rarely do. And the top two, they're doing that because they either feel more productive or they just prefer working in an office. And we said, working from home is not for everybody. Minor reasons are inadequate space at home. I know that's a real challenge depending on where you lived. And also fear of advancement. If you're in an environment where your boss is always working in the office and half your team is always working in the office, you're going to feel tempted to work in the office just to keep pace. So this last slide really conveys the sentiments, the shifting sentiments of companies and workers. This is a great roundup from Gallup. They're talking about half of the US full-time workforce is a remote capable employee. Their current job can be done remotely, working from home at least part of the time. In the left column of pie charts, this is pre-pandemic, 8% were exclusively remote jobs, 32% were hybrid jobs, and 60% were fully on site. This was normal in 2019. 2 years on, that's shifted a bunch. 39% is all remote, 42% hybrid, and 19% in the office. And when we ask companies to forecast out what they think the future looks like, 24% are remote, 53 hybrid, and 23 in the office. But the real gulf is on the right-hand side, where employees are asked what they want to do. 32% are like, yeah, I like the full-time remote thing. 59%, I crave some companionship with my colleagues, so I'm up for hybrid. And only 9% are full-time in the office, right? So that 60% on the bottom left to 9% on the right is a seismic shift. So that's kind of where we're headed, is figuring out where these percentages ultimately fall. I will point out that, where I live here in Tompkins County, or when you look at Vilas County's geographic location, it is totally feasible to live a hybrid work lifestyle where you're in a city or an office environment some days of the week and living at the lake on other days of the week or as part of a long weekend. And with that said, I'll put up a slide of the 2 books that I wrote. If you enjoyed what we talked about, there's a lot more in these 2 books. The Art of Working Remotely is filled with stories and anecdotes and advice, and the handbook is literally a tip a day with advice for individuals, teams, and managers. They're also available as ebooks, so you can visit my website or just check out where you like to buy books. And with that, I will say thank you and open it up to any questions that people have.
Great, thank you, Scott, so much. So yes, please, if you have questions for Scott, do put them in the chat. And what I learned from this, Scott, is truly that, whether you're in Ithaca, New York, or Tompkins County, or here in Vilas County, or here in the North Woods, or some of our viewers are in Milwaukee, attendees, the tips and advice that you gave are really universal right now. And so that's what I learned from this. And so thank you for your presentation. That a lot of really good information. For me, it was truly a lot about the future, about where this is all going as well. With that, let's get to the chat questions. We have one here from Scott on the topic of micromanaging. I have read that more companies are adopting productivity spyware that sits on employers' computers to monitor activity. Some can even access the camera periodically without your knowledge or permission. It demonstrates a lack of trust and raises privacy concerns. Do you see this as a growing trend in the hybrid work environment?
That's a great observation. I don't know if I can say that it's a growing trend because I don't have any raw numbers to back it up, but I do know that it is of tremendous concern. I don't believe that my company has surveillance in place. I think they can use it if they need to, but I will share something I do have direct experience with. As a companion to that remote chat that I had and to my first book, I created a website. And on that website, I put up an article about how insane I thought it was that you could go on Amazon and buy a mouse jiggler. This is a device that you place your mouse in when you leave, when you're supposed to be working, and it randomly moves your mouse around. So your computer doesn't go to sleep, and your Slack or your Teams or whatever always has a green light on because you're, quote, at your computer. So I wrote that just to kind of express some frustration that really people are doing this because they're not my people, right? If you're working remotely, it's a privilege. You have a job, you're able to do it in a beautiful place. Why would you deceive your employer, right? Well, the sad thing is, when I look at my Google Analytics for the website, month over month, that is the #1 page that people are looking for. They're looking for remote work mouse jiggler. So I think it kind of goes both ways. And it does boil down to, Scott, you mentioned the word trust. That does boil down to trust. If your employer doesn't trust you and you can't flip that equation, it might be time to find a different employer because you do have to have trust, and trust does cut both ways.
Wow, thank you for that, Scott. And Scott, I was not aware of that, so I think we all learned something here new today. The next question is from Mary Sue. Hi, Scott. Are you finding remote meetup places work as well as in-person meetup events for remote workers? Are there studies on this topic?
I haven't come across any studies on the topic. I find that I derive more satisfaction from an in real life encounter than I do in a virtual encounter. But I also did host a virtual meetup for remote workers for 5 years. So there must have been something to that. I think preferences and frankly access might play into this for everybody as an individual. But like for me personally, right now we're part of a running club, and like that is socially huge for me on the weekends, is to get together and do a group run and share a beverage and some snacks with people who are like-minded as far as fitness goes. And I always learn something new about them too. So all you have to ask is, what keeps you busy during the week? And I get a lot out of that. So I don't go to a whole lot of virtual things because I do spend most of my day on a screen. So I do disconnect on the weekends and find more joy there.
Great, thank you. And I can share with you that one of the things that we do here, the remote workers here in the North Woods, is that they are really interested in more in-person meetup events because we are so behind our screens every day, or on our iPhones or whatever the case might be, that we're craving that socialization. So we're actually looking to, at the VCEDC, schedule more meetups for both remote workers and entrepreneurs. So we want everyone to stay tuned for that. So on to the next question. My son is an accountant with a 2-year-old, works remotely. How do you balance kids and at-home work?
So back when this was a concern for me, my kids, fortunately for me, during the pandemic, they were all grown up and kind of were adults living in the house with us. At least they behaved like it most of the time. But back when my daughter was born, my boss at the time congratulated me and then asked if I was going to watch her during the day. And he was asking because he thought that would be a good idea to save me the expense of having childcare. So needless to say, we didn't do that because I knew I didn't have the discipline to watch my child and get my job done. So she went to daycare in the morning. I would feed her yogurt in the morning. My wife went off to work for a half day as a teacher. I fed my daughter her breakfast and I took her to her childcare for half the day. And then she came back, my wife came back from her halftime job and watched her for the afternoon. I know a lot of folks during the pandemic didn't have a lot of choice. And unfortunately at the time, there was no easy answer. It's like, okay, you can't go to a daycare because of COVID, right? We're just not getting together. So that unfortunately it is what it is. And you just kind of have to become a multitasker. And part of that may have looked like the slide I had up about splitting your workday and working when you had availability. Even with older kids, I find myself terribly productive in the morning. And morning, I mean like 5 to 7 a.m. So that's when I wrote my book. The house was quiet, there were no distractions, and I knew that was the only time that I had available to me to get that done. And unfortunately, there's no great answer for having a 2-year-old at the same place where you want to work.
Do the best you can, right?
You do the best you can. Yep.
Then a comment from Paula, on-site jobs also monitor what employees do on their computers. So much more, they will do it remotely.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's true. One of the rules that I never break is doing anything personal on company hardware. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in conference rooms in New York City at the mothership and seen a colleague shopping for clothing on their work computer during the meeting. And I'm like, wait a sec, like, even if you're not going to get caught, you're not paying attention to the meeting. And if you're not necessary, just go back to your desk and do work. So I think a lot of personal stuff does happen during the workday. I don't think there's a way around that, but don't use your work computer for it. Use your personal device or do it on your own time. So, but this comment from Paula, absolutely. I think it's not reasonable to think that we're not being surveilled, at least part of the time. So behave.
One of the questions is very simple, Scott, that we get emailed to us a lot and via our bot on the website. Where do you find remote working jobs? Clearly, we always promote Vilas County as a paradise for remote workers. As you mentioned earlier, like Ithaca, it is, with our incredibly beautiful North Woods and streams and forests and things. You can really have the best of both worlds with our expanding broadband. But where do you find remote working jobs? Where do you look?
Yeah. And I never played in that sandbox. Whenever somebody would ask me, I'd be like, I honestly don't know, because both of mine were accidents. I've had two jobs. The first transitioned me into remote work as an experiment. And the second, I actually transitioned into that role being hired by a manager from my first job. And he knew I could do the job remotely. So I networked my way into that role. There are websites that are dedicated to remote work. I haven't been there lately, but weworkremotely.com, if they're still doing their thing, they always have mostly tech-oriented remote work jobs that are posted. But a lot of the mainstream job boards will also now have a filter for remote work, whether it's on LinkedIn or Monster. Like, you're going to be able to find that you don't have to select a city. And that's become more prevalent because of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And I think the childcare issue as well, with more moms and dads today working at home to take care of the little ones, that is becoming more of an issue for families. So another question that we get a lot too, Scott, are how do you have that conversation with your boss or your supervisor that you'd like to transition to work remotely?
You have to couch things not in what the benefit is for you. You have to talk about what the benefit is for the employer. And a lot of that depends on what the current situation is. Are they spending a lot of money on premises? Are you wasting a lot of time in commuting and can transition that into more productivity, which ends up being more profit? Like, if you only focus on the benefits for you, you will probably be turned down. But if you can figure out, how can I demonstrate that this is a win-win, that conversation will go a lot more smoothly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Okay, we have a comment from Paula. Thank you for this. The numbers are incredible. And then we move down to John, who says, in my current role as an administrator for a tribal government operation, changing the workplace culture by offering hybrid or fully remote options has been a challenge. What are some resources that I can utilize to begin to break the old school mindset from tribal leaders who believe that productivity is measured by the number of in-person staff? I've experienced more workplace distractions that impact productivity, but it has been difficult to change old views.
I don't really know how to answer this one, because changing fixed mindsets can be difficult to impossible. And we've actually left volunteer organizations because of it. It's just this total resistance to change. I might attack the problem with numbers and say, here's where the world is going. And you have to imagine that if you want to attract other folks to work here, because attrition will happen, you do need to be more flexible if you want to attract the people you want to attract. And if that doesn't sell them, I don't know that there are many other things to do. I like to approach things with hard facts, which is hard when a lot of feelings are also bound up in coming to a place where there are inherently more distractions. You can feel resentful that you have to be there.
And Scott, one of the things that we're trying to better understand here in the North Woods is truly how many remote workers are there out there? And clearly, events like this help us identify more and more people who truly are working remotely. But remote workers are working at home. And so they're not out in the workplaces. They're not maybe perhaps necessarily at the chamber meetings and things like that. So we're very interested in having more programming like this and events where we can get a better understanding of who these people are, because we want to meet everyone. You're all doing great work. You're bringing in large incomes in many ways that is, for us, truly economic development. It doesn't necessarily have to be a big Kohl's department store or a factory of some kind. Remote workers and their families on their own bring in very generous incomes into an economy.
Yeah, when you take the aggregate incomes of a mobile working class and spread it out a little more evenly, it can mean huge things for smaller municipalities. And I feel like my impact, as small as it is, has been great for the community where I live. I'm not commuting, I'm not, doing that to the environment every day, but I am buying coffee and groceries and doing cool things like running with groups and organizing events. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Scott, thank you so much. I have had such a pleasure, and some of my colleagues too, of having the chance to meet you, speak with you. It truly has been a pleasure, and I appreciate your willingness to speak to our audience today. Obviously, we are recording this and we'll share it out on YouTube and our website and back with all of you. But it truly is cutting edge information. You've lived it, you understand it, you have incredible numbers and information, as was already stated here today. So we really together all want to thank you for your time. And now the most important thing is we'd like to give 2 of your books away.
That is a
So
fun thing. Let's do that.
that is a fun thing. So the Art of Working Remotely, which I have here in my office, and I also have the Handbook for the Modern Worker. And Scott has very generously autographed each one of those. And so my colleague Tracy has randomly picked 2 people for me who have attended today's program. And I looked at my text, and she shares with me that it is Jessica Brainard, who I've not had the pleasure to meet yet, and Jim Clay, who I've also not had the pleasure to meet yet. So I look forward to meeting you. And so you can expect your books in the mail. We'll be in touch with you on email to get your addresses. And so congratulations on winning those 2 books. And Scott, I would imagine that if anyone on this Zoom meeting would like to get in touch with you, they can contact you or me, or, I'm sure you're open to still answering more questions from people.
Absolutely. The best way to get in touch with me is through my website. It's Scott P as in Patrick Dawson.com. And I want to thank you, Kathy. This has been really fun. Thank you.
Great, you're welcome. Thank you so much. So with a minute left to go, I would just like to again thank everyone for attending. We wanted to keep this to an hour. Everyone can now go back to work, whether that's a physical place or working from home. And so do stay in touch with us. We will have more and more programming for entrepreneurs and remote workers throughout the year. So we do have your emails, and we'll be in touch. And thank you again. Enjoy your day.